Hi, Matt.
Hey Graham, good to see you.
Good to see you. This podcast is called Crazy in Love, and today we're going to talk about one aspect of being a little bit crazy in love and the different types of ways people might misinterpret what love might be or get love wrong, right?
Yeah, yeah, and like maybe one of the most famous love story of all time, Romeo and Juliet. You know, is often kind of held up as almost a romantic ideal, and I think it's pretty questionable, isn't it? Is it actually more like a cautionary tale of what goes wrong, kind of dangers of reckless passion and unchecked emotion? Like,
Yeah. So I don't know about you, but I first really discovered the story of Romeo and Juliet less through the Shakespeare play and more through the Baz Luhrmann film. I think I was a teenager at the time, and that certainly with my friends and people who were in couples at the time, they took it as the most romantic thing they'd ever seen. The kind of
yeah,
doomed young lovers
yeah,
who
star-crossed lovers, huh?
star-crossed lovers. It's a tragedy, and people think of their connection, their very, very quick connection, as being
Yeah.
incredibly romantic. But I think there's something romantic also in the idea that they can't have that long-term relationship together, that it's cut off before it can ever really blossom.
Yeah, I can't remember who it is who says, but it's a story about two teenagers in love over I don't know, whatever's over a few days, ends up in the death of six people, including themselves. You know, something like that, isn't it? And I think Juliet is specifically referred to as being 13 in the text. You know,
Yes. Yeah.
so it's very, very young. It's very immature, isn't it? And that's the bit that's the cautionary.
Yeah, but let's before we kind of dismiss it and go into all the reasons why this might not be a really good model for a proper long-term romantic relationship, let's just have a think about why people consider that to be the essence of romance, because there is something worth highlighting or worth drawing from that story in terms of what aspects of a healthy love might be, actually, that there is a genuine kind of connection between the two of them. There is a real intimacy at times between the two of them, even though in the text they don't actually meet that often.
Right. And it's lovely being in love, isn't it? If you've been in love, particularly at that young age, it is something really magical, special about it. It is intoxicating, it's all consuming. It's you know, you feel love sick almost, you know, can't
Mm.
eat, can't sleep, can't stop thinking about that person. There is sort of something wonderful about that. It's just you probably don't want that to go on for too long.
I'm often asked by clients who are dating
Mm.
whether they need to feel that kind of way in the early stages of a relationship. What do you say to people if they ask you, kind of, do all good relationships have to start with that kind of lovesick, teenage, angsty intensity at the beginning before they then develop into something a bit more mature?
I don't think they do they? I think you also hear the other side of that. I hear is that people were flatmates, housemates for a while, or they were in a
Mm.
friendship group first, and then suddenly the feelings came. Sort of, I'm thinking of Friends and sort of Monica Chandler, kind of that sort of relationship where you kick around people and then realize there are some feelings involved, and sometimes that doesn't hold, and you're better off as friends, and sometimes it works that way. So, I mean, I think lots of people have got that story. Maybe not. I don't know, not the romantic intensity of the Romeo and Juliet story, but definitely that kind of couldn't keep our hands off one another. You know, the people I see who talk about being in a sexless relationship or having less sex than they want, often the origin story of the relationship is the complete opposite of that. Like, you know, it fired on all cylinders, like everything was wonderful. And how on earth did we get to this point in time?
Yeah, something's been lost along the way.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. There's a couple of things I think about when I think about Romeo and Juliet not being a great model for romantic relationships. There's obviously the tragic ending, but there's a miscommunication between the two of them that leads to the death. There's a misunderstanding. There's something there about communication. There's something that I think often doesn't get talked about when Romeo and Juliet is considered a love story, which is that they're so isolated. There's an intensity of that isolation
Um,
away from their families in the story. But actually, I think the more sustainable love stories in reality are ones where you have a broader community invested in that relationship. You got, the whole idea of marriage is celebrating your relationship in front of the people who love you and are committed to the relationship as well. So there's something almost doomed about their relationship from the start because they're so isolated from their communities.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This is a close textual analysis you're offering.
The York Notes.
It's results day as well, isn't it?
It is.
I think you're on for an A star here.
I don't think they use that grading anymore, do they?
Do they not? You're going to tell me they don't do A levels anymore next. Levels still got. I think it was making me think of when I was sort of roughly that age, about 17, and probably between lower sixth, upper sixth, doing A levels, no doubt at that point, right? And just being in love during that summer. And however long the summer was, it felt like it went on for months and months and months. Maybe it was just 6 weeks. I think that is all summer is. But I had a relationship during that time, and it was so intense because we saw each other every day and we called all the time. And if we weren't seeing one another, we were on the phone. If we weren't on the phone, we were fixing a plan to see one another. And it felt like so full on during that time. But just to link to what you were saying there, it was just us. We weren't anybody else. And when we got back to, I don't know what it would have been, upper sixth, let's say, and life resumed as normal, it just couldn't sustain. It couldn't hold because it hadn't involved friends. It hadn't involved any kind of sporting commitments or home life or anything else.
I had a relationship at similar age, and I think something similar happened to me, but maybe teasing out something slightly different, which is that we were so isolated and so in love and so intense that I don't think we saw our friends anywhere near as much as we should have done.
Yeah, right.
We isolated ourselves from our friends because we were so in love. And at that age, 17, 18, 19, when those friends who I still see nowadays, but they were probably connecting more together in a way that shaped their relationships even today, and the depth of those relationships even today that maybe I don't quite have with them because I was so invested in this one girl at the time. I think that's, looking back, I think I made a bit of a mistake there. I would urge my 17, 18-year-old self to act a little bit differently then.
Yeah. And you see it now, don't you? Or I see it now anyway. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Tell me. In couples who want to be everything to one another, or who've still got really very high expectations of what the relationship can provide. It can provide almost everything to them, and they don't see. Thinking of guys here for a moment, they don't see as much of their male friends. They don't go and watch a game in the way that they used to in male company, and presuming that was pleasure for them and whatever else. That bit's gone. Their pursuits outside of the relationship, their hobbies, even sometimes looking after themselves, their health and fitness, that kind of goes. It gets concertinaed, it gets squashed, it gets reduced, and the relationship is, I often think they're looking for the relationship to give them just more than it can realistically provide.
Yeah, which is incentivized by pop culture, isn't it? Fundamentally.
Yeah, sure.
That's partly why we're choosing Romeo and Juliet, but there's all sorts of examples we could have chosen that reinforce this idea that there's one person out there that can complete you, that you need completing, that kind of Jerry Maguire line of you complete.
Yeah, that's the line, isn't it? That's the line I hear. Not necessarily people referencing the film, but that's the line that the partner should be like, is your other half. It's like that. It's that little bit about the soulmate, isn't it? It's that little bit about the that there is maybe sometimes in extremis one person who will do that for you. But even when people don't believe in a kind of perfect soulmate, they're still looking for that absolute composite, rather than accepting that somebody is really very different from you. And lots of the challenge of relationship is understanding that somebody else just does view these things differently. They have a different set of values to some extent that guide them. They've got a different temperament. They see the world differently. They interpret a film, a song, a book, evening out with friends differently. And that's all part of the challenge as well, that we can't finish one another's sentences. We don't think the same way about this.
Okay. Well, have you ever seen the trilogy of films Before Sunset, Before Sunrise, Before Midnight, that trilogy?
No.
I think it offers a really nice kind of development on some of the themes in Romeo and Juliet, because the first movie, they meet cute on a train traveling to Vienna. It's an American, like 18, 19-year-old guy and a French woman of the same sort of age, and they meet cute on a train to Vienna. And in the first movie, it's them kind of doing the 18, 19-year-old thing of getting to know each other, the radical honesty of asking each other intense questions and connecting in that way, like we were talking about last time. But over the three movies, you see them, the three movies cut 10 years apart. So you follow them 10 years later, and then 10 years later, further down the line. And in the last movie, they're married with twin girls, and they've got a night away from the twins to really kind of reconnect as a couple. But it's a great move from the kind of radical honesty and intensity of their teenage connection all the way through to a really one of the few honest interpretations of what it's like to be married for 20-30 years with children on screen, that they bicker, they try and find a way to connect with each other, they try and leave some of that honesty to one side and just accept that what's done is done, and they still have a shared history that they can connect with. And I think there's something about shared history and raising children together that binds people in a way that, yeah, you might lose the intensity of that teenage lovesick feeling, but there's something there that can really unite you through the years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, interesting. I think maybe a star in your film studies at A level as well. Yeah, I think that's it. It changes, doesn't it? Even in relationships that last less, that have endured for less, for not as long as that. Don't know why I'm struggling to say that. Relationships that are maybe like 2 years in rather than 20 years in. I see that as well. That initial intensity has gone. So I see lots of couples who do have family home and maybe adolescent children talking about where the love's gone or where the connection's gone. But I also see couples much younger and much earlier into their relationship, wondering where that intensity has gone and being quite panicked by it, because I think it's a really deep cultural fiction that you will be madly in love and you will stay madly in love and you'll be everything to one another. So it's not just, I mean, I liked what you were describing there, and I'll definitely look out for that. But it seems to me it happens at a much sooner point as well.
And how do you work with a couple who are worried about that? Because that might signal that the flame is flickering away, that the initial connection was actually an unrealistic connection based on maybe an unrealistic version of the other person that you're holding in your mind. You might think that they're really exciting and really independent and really ambitious, but actually that ambition reveals itself to be a slightly more egotistical selfishness, for example, after a year or two. So in some instances, it might signal something that they need to take seriously. In other instances, it might be that actually this is a shift into something different. And your job as the couples therapist is to help them to some degree understand that process and understand how they can enjoy that together.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I think they've got a free choice. I mean, I do see people who chase romantic relationships throughout their life who are somewhat nomadic and move around. I mean, it is an option. I don't think it's a moral sin, right? You can do that, but you never get to a different stage or phase of relationship, and you might be missing out by doing so. But those who want to sort of stay and grow it or endure through a more a more pedestrian phase of the relationship, I think it does mean being much more realistic and kind of letting go of some of those illusory kind of attachments that characterize the first phase of the relationship. I was thinking of that book by Irving Yalom, Love's Executioner. It's a really popular book in therapy world, and he talks about not liking terribly much working with people who are absolutely in love, in the throes of love, because a lot of the work is about questioning those unrealistic, illusory attachments and kind of being love's executioner in effect.
Yeah, I wonder how many people he sees for therapy who are genuinely in the throes of love. Those people, in my instances, don't tend to turn up to therapy that much. That
no, that's
quite happy.
That's the point. Yeah, it's one particular case study, isn't it? I don't know if you know that, but there's one particular case study where he talks about that. Somebody brings kind of an idealized version of love to him, and he wants to take it apart. And I do.
He almost gets a bit annoyed, doesn't he? He gets kind of frustrated and annoyed with them for holding such a romantic view of love, or a little bit jealousy maybe in there too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's right, isn't it? And I wonder about that. There's another guy, Hirsch, who writes about imperfect love. from a sort of psychoanalytic, psychotherapeutic point of view. And he talks about like what the therapists, what some therapists are prescribing as the answer to these things. And it's it's idealized in its own way. It's perfect communication, it's sharing, it's being open, it's all of these things that you're looking for a really satisfactory sexual union. And he's saying like, where are we optimized in our life? Are we truly optimized at work? Are we truly looking after our health and our well-being in that way? You know, and if we're not, why would we expect that in terms of our romantic life? Like maybe it just will be a bit off, you know, maybe it will be a bit unsatisfactory, maybe it will be compromised.
Yeah, one of the risks with some of what we talk about, I think, is that we make romantic relationships sound boring.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
so
Sure.
Romeo and Juliet is exciting, and
Yep.
the idea of trying to then merge over time into something a bit more mature, a bit less intense, etc., sounds a bit boring.
I agree.
I
Yeah.
really like Irvin Hershey's idea about imperfect love. There's something there that allows peaks as well as troughs. So you argue and you bicker, but you also have real excitement, sexual excitement, romantic excitement, whatever it might be, as well as boring times. So I
Yeah.
think what I really like about that is it's more of a peaks and troughs type of example of a relationship rather than this slightly boring flat line
Yeah.
that I think some people hear when we talk about
Yeah.
imperfect love.
I agree, and I think this phase. I think you're absolutely right on that. I think there's phases as well for this. There's sort of time for everything, isn't there? And I'm really glad I had that kind of relationship I had when I was 17. I'm probably less ambivalent about it, or fewer misgivings about it than maybe what you were describing at that kind of age, because it felt right. It felt like that moment, you know, it felt like a moment in time for it. I actually wouldn't want that now. I really genuinely think, hand on heart, I'm trying to reflect on this honestly ahead of our conversation. And right now, I don't think that's what I'm looking for. You know, I don't think that's what's of interest to me. So it's partly like when it happens to people that the relationship, I don't know, plateaus, there's a panic moment because it's such a cultural fiction about your relationship being everything and you'd be madly in love and all of this stuff. And it's like, it's fine, it's okay. You couldn't sustain that pace, you know. You may have come out quick, but actually to maintain that pace over 26.2 miles, it's going to have to look a bit different. And yeah, I get what you're saying about boring. I think it's a useful challenge to us and it's worth raising. But I think you wouldn't say, you know, your mile times in the marathon were boring because they were consistent, because they were, you know, it's sort of a category error.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. The word plateau even sounds boring though, right?
I
When
agree.
you said plateau, I was like, that doesn't feel right to me because
I
to
went
say,
for, yeah, I went for plateau because I was going to say flatlined, and then I was like, oh,
yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, you're right. You're onto something, aren't you?
But I do think that if a relationship feels stagnant and does feel like it is plateauing, does
Yeah.
feel like there is no excitement, no intimacy, no connection, I think there might be something wrong there. So yes, there is a cultural idea of the perfect relationship, the soulmate who completes you, and the intensity of that. I do think there's something about the advice to kind of settle for a move into something more imperfect that I think does convince some people to tolerate a relationship that is actually not very good, not very intense.
Yeah, yeah. And before we started recording, we were just talking about our family holidays, right? And that there's within a family holiday, a good family holiday probably is geared around the children. The risk is that we don't have enough adult time. We don't have enough time for our partner. We don't have any kind of, we don't bake in moments for a possible kind of romantic connection, reconnection, you know. And that, I think, if you're drawing attention to that, I completely agree. I think in relationships, people can do stupid things. You know, they can never go to bed at the same time or in the same bed, and then they wonder why they don't have sex. And it's like, you literally gonna have to be probably most of the time on a flat surface together in order to do that, right? You are gonna need to be proximate to one another for that to happen. And we
You're
do.
revealing too much about the limitations of your sex life that you need to be on a flat surface all the time, Matt.
But there's something about like, how did we think this was going to happen? You know, how did it used to happen a lot at the start of the relationship? Because you lied around on Saturday, Sunday morning till 11 a.m. before you even thought of getting up and, you know, putting a coffee on or whatever. So it's there's a bit of like watching for those things. What I see more of though when people are complaining about their relationship is not that it's gone stale or that the connection have gone, although that is the way people come into the conversation and that is often what they say first. But when I dig a bit deeper or when we get to talking about it more, actually what it's characterized by is disrespect,
Mm.
appreciating one another, actually starting to be kind of grumpy and rude around one another, far too much sharing of your aches and pains and how poorly you slept and all of that stuff. You would never put that in a dating profile. You would never talk about that on the first date. If you fancied somebody at work, that wouldn't be the conversation you had with them down the pub or in the coffee point. You would be doing something a whole lot different from that. So often, although people say the love's gone or it's gone stale, it's gone flat, what they're often talking about is it's kind of crappy. There are some crappy behaviors that have come into this relationship, and if you could get rid of those, I think you get back to something which felt like what we're describing, and then you could decide whether there was something there. Eliminate the crappy behaviors, and then has this run its course? But often, like that sense of companionship, where it's a nice relationship, we're appreciating one another, we have nice times together. That's often enough. Again, it's in danger of sounding boring, but that kind of peace and serenity and calm, that can be lovely too.
Yeah, absolutely. I really agree with the idea around behaviors and behaviors being the key to disharmony and a lack of satisfaction in a relationship. It's still, when you talk about peacefulness and serenity, does sound a bit boring to me. It does sound like we're in danger of suggesting that relationships need to be a little bit boring. And even when we're talking about kind of romance, I think it can sound a little bit boring too, rather than that you can have moments of real intensity
Yeah,
as well
yeah.
in a relationship that is 20, 30, 40 years old, and almost should expect and work for them. They
Mm-hmm.
won't happen by accident, maybe, is partly what we're saying, right?
Yeah,
That
sure.
if your daily routines don't align with one another, the moments of real intense desire are unlikely to happen too, because you're not giving yourself opportunity for it. But I don't want to
Yeah,
ignore that most people want some intensity. They want to feel desired
yeah.
as well as to feel liked.
I agree. I agree. And the couples who I work with and who achieve like a kind of reconnection and rekindle, physically, so they'll have sex again for the first time in ages. You can see a lightness to them. You can almost see as they come through the door. It's like, something's gone on, and they'll be quite sort of a bit giggly and shy about it, almost, to introduce that, and it gives them a lift. Like it puts a spring in their step, that kind of thing that you're the thing that you're talking about. I guess we feel desired, we feel wanted again, we feel like we really matter. And there are ways of doing that in the everyday, aren't they? More sort of quotidian ways, but also that moment of someone still desires me, someone still wants me, somebody still gets pleasure from me. That bit, I think you're right to call attention to. That can't, for most people, that can't go missing altogether.
And one, I would also add, it's not just about being desired. I think it's about feeling interesting to the other person. That when you've been together, even for a couple of years, I think the intensity of the wanting to get to know the other person,
Yeah,
the excitement of being around the other person, inevitably wanes a bit. So you end up talking at a much more basic, prosaic level, rather than actually, I'm still interested in what this person thinks about the world, how they perceive things, how different they are to me, and what can I learn from them, rather than a lot of couples, I think, just stop talking at that level once the initial intensity stops. And I think part of the way that we can help couples is by reintroducing that sense of curiosity and interest in the other person, that leads the other person to think, oh, okay, they actually find me interesting again, rather than just this boring person that they know everything about,
yeah,
which cuts across that romantic idea of, well, to be in love, you need to know everything about someone. I
sure.
think the opposite is true, that we always want to have a bit of mystery and a bit of, I
Yeah,
don't quite know what that person's holding in their minds. And that's interesting. I want to find out. I want to find that out because
yeah, yeah.
that
Well, that makes
mystery
tons of
excites
sense.
me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the other person to be interested in you, you've got to be interesting, right? To bring
Yeah.
it full circle, you've got to be doing stuff outside the relationship, because I think it's the bit about lockdown that people really struggled with. It's like, oh, what you've been up to today? It's like, well, same as you. I sat in one room and did work calls, and you sat in the other room and did work calls. We're bumping into one another. We know too much about.
Yes, but I think that often goes to, well, the other person needs to go out of the house and do things. I'm talking at the level of you're often in bed together reading different books. How
Yeah.
often are couples talking about, why did you choose that book? What's that book about? What are you getting from that book? If they read the same book, are they
Yeah.
talking about how they felt differently about it, or are they just
Yeah.
ignoring that potential avenue of connection and interest?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. So I think there is something about going out of the house, isn't there? Have you still got your friends? You know, is your partner still going out and doing things that you don't know much about, that you know that you could be curious about, that could be kind of intriguing and interesting? And you know, what is it about that particular experience that they enjoy? I think the successful couples during lockdown were kind of intrigued by hearing their partner on their work calls, like, oh wow, they're so much more polite, or they're so assertive, or wow, they really know this, or like, I don't know what you're talking about when you're having those client calls, you know, and getting curious about that. So I think for one group, I mean, it's too binary, but just to make the point, for one group, it's like, this is boring. No, this is just repeating. And for others, it's like, oh, this is new, this is curious, we're thrown together, and how do we make this work? You know, how do you see something of interest in the other one and probe that in the way that you're describing there with the reading? Like, why that book? You know, what are you liking about it? Are you going to finish it? You know, why do you always finish a book? I usually start a book and then don't finish it. You'd have a bunch of conversations around that might be interesting, rather than annoying or frustrating or just not had.
Hmm. How often do you see all of this kind of leading to really unrealistic expectations about relationships that drive the ending of relationships, like people making decisions to end their relationships because they're not perfect, because they haven't found the ideal person? Does that, in your experience, happen a lot? That
Yeah, I
people
think it
make
does. I think it
mistakes from
happens.
that place?
I think it does happen quite often. And I mean, I don't really have a stance on it, because I think if it's what you want, I mean, I think there's always heartbreak and disappointment when relationships end, even for the person ending them. But sometimes that feels like the right or necessary step. All I think is you're going to swap out one set of problems for another, you know, beyond the first couple of weeks, couple of months, certainly couple of years. You're just going to have a different set of challenges. So for me, it never feels like the panacea. And what often happens with the couples that I'm working with is they've got children. So you're still going to have to communicate. You're still going to have that clash of values, where they go to school, what sports they do, how seriously you take that, all of that stuff, that kind of the difficulties that they're facing, not just when it's boring, but when it's argumentative and it's contested, like that kind of stays with you. And you've thrown a new relationship into the mix, and all the challenge that goes with a blended family. For some people, they seem to absolutely swim. They do it brilliantly well. They seem to Christmas together, and it's wonderful. But for lots of people, not. For lots of people, it's hard. So I think sometimes, I suppose if I had a bias, it's that people throw stuff away that maybe could be worked on. If that connection was strong in the first instance, my sort of start point is, well, why couldn't it be again? Have we changed so radically, or are we doing different behaviors? Are we being grumpy? Are we being argumentative? Are we being discourteous around one another? Are we constantly telling each other how tired we are, rather than appreciating the other person, making time for them, tuning in, asking them about what they're reading and why, making time on holiday for those moments of connection? That's the sort of bit I want to check first before throwing in the towel.
Yeah, even if the relationship ends, some of those behaviors, particularly if there are children involved, need to ideally change. So contempt, disrespect, if you carry that into the post-relationship world, it's going to make life difficult for everyone, including the children.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, but I guess that's the other thing I'd say about it. The thing about romantic love is it's tempestuous. You know, you're
Yeah.
allowed to throw your weight around. You're allowed to scream and shout. You're allowed to be like super jealous. And I think it's a conversation for another podcast, isn't it? But I think absolutely the opposite of that. Those things will wreck the relationship, often quite quickly, and you know, with 100% guarantee, will do so over time.
Yeah, there's definitely another conversation about arguments, isn't there? About how do you tolerate and is it good to have a bit of tempestuous elements to a relationship? I think there's a bit of nuance in there, isn't there, for us to tease out on another day.
Yeah, definitely. I think where I start from is that people have baked in far too much acceptance of that is okay, that characterizes romantic love. It's certainly what I thought as a younger man, that that those kind of strong feelings of jealousy mean that I really love you. I'm not sure that was true. I think it meant that I had a bunch of stuff that I hadn't kind of worked through, and I was overreacting to things and behaving really very poorly in those circumstances, and who in the end wants to be around that.
Well, I think that's a strong connection to what we were talking about. I think a lot of the lovesick elements of teenage love and lust is about insecurity, is about a lack of self-control, a lack of moderation, and throwing everything into it that I think we're saying can't last and shouldn't last. That actually, when it does come, you need to be a bit careful about how much you lean into the all-encompassing feelings and intensity of
Yeah.
those early times. Because I think Romeo and Juliet, if nothing else, is a kind of indication that, I think it's the friar in Romeo and Juliet, I can't remember exactly, but says something like violent love can lead to violent death, that moderation in all things is usually the best way forward. And there is a bit of moving away from the romance and more to the tragedy. There's a tragedy of the intensity of that kind of love at times.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe final thing from me, I think, to try and pick up on what you're talking about, that maybe our description of uh, love over the longer term can feel a bit passive. I think the relationships that are good, that I admire, there's a lot of work going into that. There's a lot involved in that. People are keeping themselves in good shape. They're doing interesting things. They're reinventing themselves. They're trying out new stuff. They're bringing that home. They're talking about it in a way that invites curiosity and involves the other person, not necessarily in terms of a shared hobby, but just like, this is what I'm doing, this is why. There's effort, there's vigor to those things. I don't think a good relationship is a passive, allows for a passive stance. I think you've got to put some thought and creativity into that as well.
Good. Do you think Romeo and Juliet would have lasted as a couple?
It's an intriguing question, isn't it? No, I suspect not. They're too young, aren't they? I think there's something about, like, the time of life you meet somebody at as well. I think those relationships have a moment in time. I wouldn't repeat how I was as an A-level student or undergrad. I think kind of pass through those phases. What do you think?
I think they'd end up Facebook stalking each other in their
Yeah.
mid-40s when they have children with other people.
They'd have been in your office or mine, wouldn't they? Or somebody's trying to unravel it all and
Yeah,
work out where it all went wrong, and
yeah, exactly.
why they
Maybe
learn from their children.
been through a bit of therapy to deal with the aftermath.
All
All
right.
right, let's leave it there. Good to see
Yeah,
you.
nice to see you.